Hey, Peter here with Unison, and today we're going to be reconstructing several of the synths, an ARP, and a bass from the song Giving Up by QUIX. I'll walk you through how I made each of these patches, but first let's just play them down once and A/B them against the reference. There's quite a lot going on here. There's a good chance you'll miss some of this MIDI data, so I'm going to go ahead and attach the MIDI files in the description below, along with the files for the patches themselves. Alright, let's check out what we've got. So there's so much sidechaining on this song that we can actually pluck the kick out of a really dense mix without too much trouble. You can see I've just dragged the initial hit from the chorus down to its own track, and I'm going to turn that little bit of audio into our kick. We've got some bleed from the synths, but we can minimize that while keeping the character of the kick. I'm going to use a gain plugin to put it in mono, and then FabFilter's multiband compressor to attenuate some of the high frequencies where the synths stand out, but with a really long attack time, so we let just the transient from the high end poke through before clamping down. You can see that as I dial back the attack time, clamps down on all the highs. We want to let the highs through for just a split second before clamping down. We end up getting what sounds like the kick with a little bit of static on it, but that's going to be completely buried in the mix by the synths themselves. Okay, ducking. The kick and bass are routed directly to our stereo outputs, and the rest of our synths are routed to our ducker. In this case, it's a FabFilter Pro C, and I'm triggering that with our kick. You'll notice that the bass is both routed to the direct outputs and to the ducker via this send to bus 10. I'm doing that to allow some of the attack from the bass to add to the punch of the kick, while still allowing it to bloom with the rest of the synthesizers. Let's listen with and without the ducker. The bass is a pretty straightforward square wave. We're going to start off by dropping oscillator A down by an octave, and then selecting a square wave from the basic shapes wavetable. Down in our voicing section, we're going to enable mono and legato, and then turn the portamento up to about 90 milliseconds. Mono ensures that we can only trigger one note at a time. Legato will smooth out our attack in sections where we have overlapping MIDI notes. And there are a few spots where we'll want those portamento glides. Okay, random phase down so that the attack of each note has the same character. Then we're going to route this through a Moog low 24 with key tracking on, resonance down, and a cutoff around 2300. Just tighten this up with some light compression. And I'm going to create just a tiny bit of attack by sending a downward ramp on LFO 1 to our global master tuning. Just make sure that you deactivate beats per minute. Put this in envelope mode and make sure that the type in the matrix window is set to unidirectional. And then just increase the rate until the pitch glide starts to feel more like a tap. And then we'll set macro 2 as the aux source so that we can control this more easily. We really don't need much attack for this song since we want the bass to sit behind the kick anyway, but this makes the patch more usable if you want to use it for other things. also going to give you some tone options by sending pulse width modulation warp to macro 1. And sometimes when you're routing through a filter, it changes the perceived pitch just a little bit. In this case, we went just slightly sharp, so I'm going to lower the fine tuning in oscillator A by 9 cents. Here's some of the pitch glide automation data. Actually, I forgot to change the pitch wheel parameters. Make sure that you set the pitch wheel range from -5 to +7 for these automations to sound correct. I just want to show that we have some overlapping notes like this, where you can hear some legato. Okay, let's get started on the main super saw. Before I forget, this time I'm going to start off by setting the pitch wheel range from -5 to 2. And for this patch, we're going to want some wide white noise. If you own any of the Unison sound collections, there's a good chance that you already have this stereo white noise. But if you don't, then you can find a link to this noise file in the description below. I'm going to pitch this down to about 38. Increase our level to about 40. Alright, let's get some width going here. Some parts of this chorus sound better with this much low-pitched white noise, and some parts of the chorus sound better with a little bit less. So I'm going to give you control of that using macro 2. Let's route through our multi-band compressor. A little bit of top. And we don't need most of these lows. There's this one section where the synthesizers cut in and out in a 16th note pattern. I'm going to get this effect using LFO1. I'm going to set it to a square wave, 1/16 in trigger mode. And we can just drag that to turn down the level of all of our oscillators. I'll preemptively turn down oscillator B as well. Now set macro 1 as the aux source. And you can see that we're automating macro 1 to turn on in just this one spot. Let's switch this to a DS saw. And add some tube distortion for my texture. I want to get a more harmonically complex top end, so I'm going to use oscillator B as an FM source for oscillator A. I'm going to start off by copying oscillator A to oscillator B and turning down the level of B. And then in oscillator A's warp mode, select FM from B. Some added complexity and sparkle on the top. Smooth out the unisons on oscillator B. I actually want to hear a little bit of oscillator B. I'm going to give you control of the FM amount using macro 3. In the reference, there's some vibrato in this patch, so I'm going to use LFO2 set to a triangle wave. Just drag and drop that to the fine tuning of oscillator A. In trigger mode, with a rate of 1/8 triplet. One thing to notice is that as we back off the FM synthesis, this vibrato becomes much more pronounced. So I'm also going to set macro 3 as an aux source for the vibrato to ensure that the vibrato doesn't get too crazy if we back off the FM synthesis. And let's change the wavetable position on oscillator B. Too much low end here, so I'm going to route all 3 oscillators through a high 12 filter with key tracking on, resonance set to 0, a little bit of drive, and a cutoff around 270 Hz. And just some final EQ touch-ups. I'm going to give us a boost around 10K for some air. And another boost in the low mid-range for some extra body. If you want to dial back on the pop at the leading edge of these notes, really for any of the patches, just extend the attack time on envelope 1 very slightly. In the mix, the pops are completely inaudible, since that space is largely occupied by the kick, but even if they were audible, they could actually help a little bit, because we did lose some of that high-end bite from the kick. That being said, if you're playing these patches in solo and do want to eliminate that pop, just increase the attack time on envelope 1 very slightly. In the AB at the beginning of this video, macro 2 was set to 60% and macro 3 was set to 41%, but you can set these however you like. Alright, here's our automation. Just the chop automation we talked about and some pitch bends. If we listen to the reference while isolating the mid from the sides, we'll hear that there are some notes that are clearly audible in the center, but are hardly discernible at all on the sides. So for this reason, I'm adding a second layer with different chord voicings that will sit primarily in the center of the stereo field. Just like in the previous patch, I'm going to start off by setting our pitch bend range from -5 to 2. Then I'm going to take a Juno saw wave, route it through a multiband compressor, which I'm going to use to remove some low end and attenuate the mid-range. I'm going to add a touch of stereo presence using hyper, dimension, and some chords. And add in some noise from an ARP circuit that I'm going to sculpt by sending through a high 12 filter. Once again, I'll be using LFO1 for this square wave chop automation. So we're going to select a square wave LFO, and we're going to drag and drop that to the levels for our noise oscillator and oscillator A, dragging those levels all the way down in trigger mode with a 1/16th note rate. And as before, we'll use macro 1 as the aux source for LFO1. I'm also going to assign macro 2 to the noise level and macro 3 to the chorus mix level to give you easier access to those parameters. Then I'm going to use LFO2 to create some vibrato. I'm going to send it in trigger mode with a rate of 1/8 triplet to oscillator A's fine tuning. And use macro 4 as the aux source for this. We're still missing some high frequency air way out on the sides, and all my noise oscillators are occupied right now, so I'm going to add a third layer using just a noise oscillator. I'm going to set it to aircan 2, set the voicing to mono, and then I'm going to spread it way out to the sides using dimension and delay. I'll turn the mix up on the delay to 100% and make both the left and the right sides very fast but slightly different, while keeping the filter wide open. Then I'm going to route the air can through a high 24 filter with a resonance of 0 and a cutoff somewhere around 6K. Compensate on our master volume. And just as with the other layers, we're going to use LFO1 for this chop square wave. I'll skip through it this time since you already know how to do it, but just make sure that in addition to routing it to the noise oscillator level, you also route it to the dimension mix, so that when the synths chop out, we also chop off that sort of faux room noise that dimension adds. Okay, ARP time. I'm going to use Serum's default saw wavetable. I'm just going to warp it a bit with some asym plus. Then I'm going to turn it into a pluck by going down to envelope 1 and turning the sustain down all the way, and turning down the decay to 176 milliseconds, straightening out this curve just a bit. Oh, and let's switch the voicing to mono. We're going to route this through a Moog Low 24 with key tracking on. I'm going to turn the cutoff all the way down and then use envelope 1 as a modulation source. Just drag and drop envelope 1 to the cutoff. And I want to modulate between 0 and 46 with a resonance of 29. Let's send this through our multi-band compressor. I'm going to roll off all of the highs and boost the mid-range almost all the way up. And then just like we did on that air patch, I'm going to spread this way out to the sides using delay, hyper, dimension, and chorus. This time I'll leave a slight bit of feedback on the delay. But we'll turn the mix all the way up, leave the filter completely open. The default chorus setting works fine here. Then we'll just roll off everything below about 1.5K using our EQ plugin. And I'll assign that to macro 1 if you want to open it back up. And pitch-wise, this sounds just slightly flat compared to the ARP on the reference, so I'm going to adjust the fine-tuning up about 18 cents. On the reference, there's this really prominent vocal chop built out of the word up. It's really reverberant and just sort of creates this spatial bed that the rest of the synthesizers sit in. So I just added one more patch to fill in that space. I'm not going to walk through how to make this one since it's not actually in the song, and I recommend that you use a vocal chop instead. But I just threw it in there to occupy that space that the vocal sample was occupying. At any rate, I'll attach it in the description below as well. Alright, let's put it all together. If you like what we're doing here at Unison, I hope you'll hit subscribe. And for more sounds like this, be sure to check out Unison's Mellow collection for Serum. If you have any feedback or questions or requests, just leave those in the comment section below. And one commenter and or subscriber will receive a free Unison sound pack. This has been Peter with Unison, and the track is Giving Up by QUIX.